Hey church, Christmas season is here. This is often the month where we get bombarded by what society tells us we need to focus on. We're buying gifts, attending parties, snagging sales, making last-minute travel plans, trying to create memories with our families. These aren't bad things, but it starts to feel more like a mad scramble to fit everything in, instead of a moment to reflect on the greatest gift we were ever given. I want to challenge all of us to slow down this Christmas and remember what it's all about. Christmas is the perfect season to focus on generosity. It's not just about the gifts under the tree, it's about the joy created when we give to others. In fact, your support here at South Hills Church helps create meaningful experiences, supports our community outreach, and ensures that ministry continues to happen. So thank you for the way that you have faithfully given. I want to show you a quick look on where our budget is so far this year based on your giving. These numbers reflect the overall budget we set for the fiscal year. You'll also see the amount received based on the tithes and offerings. And finally, you'll see the current difference in our budget that we need to make up before June 30th. I believe it's important to be transparent with our budget and let you know where we are at as a church. This is why tomorrow, December 4th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we are going to hold a Zoom meeting to let you in on our church finances. You get an opportunity to meet the team behind running our finances, who holds us accountable. You're going to be able to ask questions. So if you'd like to be a part of our financial church meeting tomorrow at 6 p.m., you can sign up through our Church Center app so you can be a part of this meeting. As we approach the end of the year, it's a great time to be thinking about how we can make a difference through our giving. Oh, and don't forget that when you give before the year wraps up, it's all tax deductible. One more added bonus as you're thinking about what God might be asking you to do this holiday season.
We try to fold the Christmas story into something simple and sweet. But the characters aren't at all two-dimensional. And the forces that sought to sabotage them are still a threat to you.
So you probably know this, but every good story has 5 basic elements. So the first one is that of the protagonist, the good guy, the hero, the good girl, the heroine. And that good guy, that protagonist, they always want something. They want to do something. They want to go somewhere. They want to have something. They want to win someone's heart. They want something. And then secondly, you have the antagonist. You have the bad guy. You have the villain. Somebody who's standing in the way of the hero. And they want something too. And oftentimes in a lot of good stories, what they want is in direct opposition to what the hero wants. And they got to face off and sort of figure that out. Number 3, you have an inciting incident. Something happens between the hero and the villain that sort of brings those two parties together, that kicks off the story and all of the things that come after that, which leads to the 4th part, which is conflict. There's got to be some challenge, some quest, some struggle between both the hero and the villain, the good guy and the bad guy. And sometimes the conflict is just internally within the hero himself or herself, where they're just struggling with whatever it is they're trying to do and all the doubts or whatever that's holding them back. And then finally, the 5th element is that of resolution, where it all builds to the pinnacle moment in the story where someone wins and all the plot holes get closed up in theory and all the tension gets resolved in theory, and where in most movies you find out something ridiculous like it was aliens all along that caused everything to happen or whatever. And honestly, like, Christmas stories are no different. Everybody's got their favorite Christmas movie, right? I love them all, except for Hallmark movies. Hallmark movies are like the Crocs of Christmas movies. They just shouldn't exist. Nobody should watch them. But if you do, it's fine, to each their own. But I love all the Christmas movies. I love Elf. I love It's a Wonderful Life. I love Die Hard, all the classics. And one of my favorite Christmas movies, though, of all time is Christmas Vacation. Anybody with me on that one? It's a great movie, right? Well, one of the fascinating things about that movie is when you think about it, it's really hard to pin down who the bad guy is in the story. I mean, when you're watching it, it kind of seems like it would be Clark's boss, Frank Shirley, which is this guy, because, he's kind of a jerk. He runs the corporation. He's not really given the bonus. He's kind of stingy, all that stuff. But then you also have cousin Eddie, who's like just makes the movie, right? Like, and he is just a problem. He's a thorn in Clark's side from the time that he arrives. He's well-intentioned, but he's just messing everything up. You can't forget about Todd and Margot, the super obnoxious neighbors that are next door. Like, they're not very likable people. And then there's Uncle Lewis too. Like, you don't sleep on Uncle Lewis. He burnt down the Christmas tree, right? He's like cranky and crotchety. Like, and if you actually step back and think about it, maybe, just maybe it's Clark that's the problem. Maybe he's not the hero. Maybe he's like so obsessed with his own expectations and what he wants that he's not really aware of or concerned with how what he's doing and what he wants is affecting all the people around him. Or maybe it's both, which is kind of actually how life works, right? That's how our stories are. They're not all one thing or another because we're not all one thing or another. Now, when you woke up for church this morning, you probably had no idea that you were going to get some philosophical analysis of the Griswolds and Christmas Vacation. But that's how we roll at South Hills. See, the reality is, I think we're all Clark. We're all Clark Griswold, because everybody arrives to the Christmas season with expectations, feeling like it should be amazing, desperately wanting it to be amazing. I mean, it's right there in the song, right? It's the most wonderful time of the year. And there is so much goodness. There's so much to look at. There's so much good food. There's so many amazing experiences and so much good food. And there's the lights and so much good food. But there's also other things about Christmas, things that we don't talk about that much. There's the real life stuff. Sometimes the holiday season actually brings into focus all the struggles, all the pains of life. It reminds us of all the things that we wish that we could fix or heal or change, but we can't. It reminds us that there's a heartache that we've just kind of learned to live with. Whether it's the financial pressure to pull off something amazing for your kids, or the loss and pain of a relationship that's broken, or people who are missing, or loved ones that you've lost, or just the experience of celebrating more with family and friends than any other time of the year, but feeling isolated and alone more than ever. Christmas really is special, but we often want it to be something it can never be, which is perfect. And when it's not, it's easy to look around and to see all the people and all the reasons why it's not, right? Whether it's your mother-in-law or your brother-in-law or your cousin Eddie or the jerk in the parking lot at Costco or your boss. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. We saw that same guy at Costco. Or it's the economy or the government, or it's those darn young people, those Gen Zers and their weird language and their TikToking, or it's those old people and the boomers that are just so out of touch. But what if it's not any of those people? What if it's not any of those things? What if, like Clark, it's not everybody else? What if it's actually us? Because sometimes we are the hero, but sometimes we're also the problem. Sometimes we're the enemy in our own story. When you read the story of the first Christmas, the good guys and the bad guys seem pretty clear. And not surprisingly, most of us, when we read these stories, and they're not new to you, even if you're not a church person, you probably know some of them. But when we read these stories, and we're going to read them each, different parts of the story each week, we can find ourselves somewhere in the Christmas story, because that's the way good stories work, right? But what might be surprising for us is exactly where we find ourselves in the story. So in Matthew chapter 2, beginning with verse 1, it says this. It says, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. So this sentence is kind of the setup for the story, at least in the Matthew account of the Christmas story. It's the kind of sentence that most of us skip over on our way to the good stuff, to the good parts, to the parts that we know. But it's not incidental, it's not insignificant that Matthew told us this part of the story, because he's telling us that what we're about to read happened in a particular place at a particular time under the rule of a particular person. He's giving us details that all matter because they're about to tell the rest of the story. And if you don't have some of that context, you might miss why it's so important or exactly what's going on. So at this time in history, the known world was ruled by Rome. You probably are aware of that. And Rome was ruled by Caesars, little Caesars, big ones, all kinds of sizes of Caesars, all leaving a legacy of delicious salad for us. But when Jesus was born, Augustus was the Caesar in Rome, and he did something that no one had ever done before. He united the entire Roman Empire under one ruler, himself. Now, the problem with conquering the world is, how do you run something so big? Like, how do you manage it all? Well, the answer for them was that they would go into an area, they would find somebody, and they would be like, hey, you look like, you can be an enforcer. We got you, and we're going to make you the king of this area to rule on our behalf. And then they would tell them, as long as you do what we tell you, and you just sort of rule however you want, and you can keep, a lot of the riches, as long as we get our cut, you can enrich yourself, you can tax whatever you want to tax. You live under our thumb, and the people will live under your thumb. In the land of Israel, Rome went in and they found a young half-Jewish warrior named Herod, and they declared him the king of the Jews, which, if you know anything about the Jesus story, is a really, really interesting title. So this is actually Herod. This is a bust that was made of him, and what we know about him at this point is he's got a sweet neck beard. That's what we know from that statue. But Herod was no joke. He was powerful and rich and ambitious. He built palaces and gymnasiums and temples and theaters and aqueducts and walls and baths and fountains and stadiums and colonnades. He paved roads. He funded artists and innovators. He sponsored athletes. He actually rescued the Olympic Games when they were going to just go by the wayside. And honestly, that's not even the half of it. He rebuilt the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. He built a massive palace called the Masada. But like all good kings and rulers, he didn't just want one palace. He wanted a second palace that was kind of halfway between Jerusalem and his hometown. But he really wanted his second palace to be on top of a mountain. The problem is the place that he wanted to build it was just flat desert. But that didn't stop him, because when you're king, nothing can stop you. So he made his people build him a mountain, which he named Herodium. There it is, kind of an artist rendering of what they built. Everything you see there actually is the palace. That little pool down at the bottom there at the time was the largest pool in the world. The gazebo that's out in the middle was so big it could only be reached by a gondola. You had to get on a boat, and they would paddle you over there, and they would serve lunch, and you could eat grapes and cheeses and other things that they did in the Roman Empire. Life's good when you're the king, right? And so he just made his people build a mountain, and then he made them build a palace on top of that mountain. Now, of course, someone had to pay for all of the things that he was doing, and it wasn't going to be him. And so the taxes that he charged were absolutely crushing. Between the Roman tax and then Herod's tax and the temple tax and all the other taxes, most people in Israel in the first century were paying like 80 to 90% tax, which is a little higher than, there'd probably been a tea party if that was us. But maybe the thing that Herod was most known for was how ruthless he was. If the religious leaders of Israel wouldn't sign off on something, he would just execute them and do it anyway and get more religious leaders. He was extremely paranoid that people would be plotting against him and trying to get rid of him. He had 11 wives and 43 kids, and it was said that he only really loved one of his wives, but he became so suspicious of the one wife that he loved that he eventually killed her. He murdered his mother-in-law. He murdered his brother-in-law. He actually murdered a couple brother-in-laws. He murdered 2 of his own sons because he suspected them of trying to usurp his authority, of take over. And so he threw this one giant party, and this is how ruthless he was. He had one of his sons drowned at the party in front of all the guests. They dragged him into the pool, and they drowned his son because he wanted everybody to know, I'm the guy, don't mess with me. He was also known for putting on disguises and going out into the marketplace, and he'd walk around and he'd listen for people to say negative things about him. And when they did, he would send descriptions of them to his soldiers to have them arrested and executed. So yeah, it's pretty obvious. Herod is the bad guy in the story. And so it's with all of that as kind of the backdrop that then this happens in Matthew 2. The rest of verse 1 says this: about that same time, some wise men from the eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, where is the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we've come to worship him. King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. And so he called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of the religious law, and he asked them, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? In Bethlehem in Judea. For this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you, who will be the shepherd for my people Israel. So in this part of the story, these guys, looking back, if you've heard this, it makes sense to us because we've heard the story so many times. But as it's unfolding in real time for the first time, these guys show up who don't really fit anywhere in the story. And we don't even really know exactly where they're from. They're just from somewhere east. And you guys know what people from the east side are like. You've been around those people. The point is, these guys don't belong. They're not from around here. Have you ever showed up somewhere and it was immediately obvious to everyone that you were an outsider? So we had that incredible experience when we have a son who's 13 that we adopted from China when he was 3. And so we traveled as a family to go to China. And it was obvious from the moment we stepped off the plane that we were outsiders. In the airport, I went to take a picture of something, and a guy with a giant machine gun came up to me and started yelling at me about something. We went out in public. We would go jogging in the mornings, and we would jog around the block of our hotel, and all the little old Chinese people that were in the park doing Tai Chi and stretching and working out in the morning, they would all come to the fence, and we would run by, and they'd be like, yeah, and they're cheering us. And then our guide would be like, look, it's too hot. You Americans, you white people, you can't handle the heat. Stay inside. And I'm like, dude, we got this. He wasn't lying. It was hot. Then we went to Olympic Village in Beijing, and while we were there, just random people would come up to us and grab our kids and pose for a picture with some other person and then just walk away because most of them had never seen white children or blonde hair before. So yeah, we really, really stuck out. Now, the wise men, they didn't necessarily stick out ethnically or biologically or culturally. They may have, but they stood out for a much bigger reason. They actually stuck out religiously. See, the story of Jesus was not supposed to be their story. And some of us, we know exactly how that feels. You didn't grow up going to church. You didn't grow up believing in God or the Bible. You didn't grow up knowing all the songs or all the stories or seeing all the Old Testament stuff. The Jesus story was not supposed to be your story, but here you are. And nobody's more surprised by that than you are. See, I think part of what Matthew is getting at is that no matter who you are, no matter where you're from, no matter what you've done, no matter what you've believed or how you've believed, that God has come for you. Even if you're from the eastern lands, even if the place that you started seems as far away from God as you can possibly get, that there's no distance that's too far for him to find you, that he's inviting you into his story. And so these guys go following this star, and it leads them, and they ultimately go to Jerusalem, because if you're looking for the king of the Jews, you go to the capital of Israel, Jerusalem. And they end up before the king. They end up before Herod. a maniacal, paranoid, murderous control freak, the guy who spent, at this point, the last 30 years eliminating every threat and every challenge to his rule. And now, all of a sudden, there's a newborn king of Israel. You don't have to be an expert in human behavior to know exactly how he was going to take that news. Matthew simply describes Herod as being disturbed. And all of Jerusalem was disturbed with him. Everyone else was disturbed because Herod was disturbed. Have you ever been in that kind of environment where one person in the family or one person in the group dictates how everything else and everyone else goes for everybody else in the family or the group? If they're happy, man, everybody's happy. But if they're upset, if they're disturbed, if they're frustrated, if they're mad, everybody's not making eye contact. Everybody's upset. Everybody's disturbed. Everybody's frustrated. Everybody's catering to them. Everybody's trying to get out of the way. Everybody's trying to make it happen. So Herod calls in the experts. He calls the chief priests and the teachers of the law, the people who knew the Torah, the Old Testament scriptures. And they quote a couple of the prophecies telling him and the wise men exactly where Jesus was supposed to be born. And part of the reason why I love this story is because I want you to know this morning that God has been and is speaking to you, and you don't want to miss it. See, it's easy for us to just sort of gloss over the fact that God had been speaking, that they're reading prophecies because God had previously spoken, that they're following a star because God is drawing them into his story, that God is speaking to them. Have you ever tried to connect or communicate with somebody, but they didn't hear it or they didn't get it? They just sort of missed it. Like you dropped the hints, you left them a note, you sent them a text. I mean, it felt like you were spelling it out for them as plain as you could spell it out for them, but they missed it all. It's sort of like being a wife communicating to your husband. We can't read minds, ladies. It's not just that you tried to spell it out. You better spell it out or we ain't getting it. See, Christmas is a reminder that God is speaking in general, of course, but he's also speaking to you. In the Christmas story, he speaks through prophets and signs and whispers and miracles and the scriptures and choirs of angels. See, the truth is that God can speak clearly enough through a star to a person who knows nothing about him if their heart is longing to find him, just like he did with the wise men. But there is no language that he can create to get your attention if you don't want to hear from him. In the story, the contrast is so obvious that the ones who had been entrusted with the scriptures, the ones who had grown up with the words of God, they weren't looking for the Messiah. They weren't looking for Jesus. They had all the information and they missed the signs. Even after hearing the story of the wise men, they didn't even bother to travel 6 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, where they themselves said that he was going to be born, if only just to check it out, to see. They didn't need to do that. They were sure it wasn't him. They were sure they had the answers. They were sure they knew what God was doing. But the outsiders, the magicians, the ones who didn't know the scriptures and they didn't know the prophecies, they were willing to travel from the east, wherever, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles to follow a star, believing and hoping and searching for God. Yeah, I think part of what we see in the story is that you can be irreligious and completely miss God, but also you can be completely religious and completely miss God. You can be distant and disinterested and lost, but you can also be devout and devoted and be just as lost as the teachers, the experts, the religious experts missed it all. Part of the takeaway in this story for me is always a warning that it's possible for me to come to this time of year, to this story, to this moment, to know all of this information, to know all the details, to know all the verses, to know the story inside and out, but the familiarity that I have with the story just gets in the way, and I actually miss God in the middle of all of it. So Matthew tells us, he says, then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men. And he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. And he told them, go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. When you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too. If you think he was wanting to go and worship too, he also has a mountain he'd like you to build him in the desert. If you know the story, the wise men actually outsmart him. We know he wasn't wanting to go worship because he ends up murdering a lot of babies, trying to kill the Messiah. Have you ever pretended to be searching for God, but what you really wanted was for him to just leave you alone so you could do your own thing? I mean, we say that we have that kind of language sometimes around church. We know all the phrases, we know the things we should say, but in our hearts, we really just kind of want to do our own thing. See, the truth is God will move heaven and earth to reach you and to get your attention if you are searching for him. You don't have to settle for the rumors and stories and secondhand God moments and secondhand Jesus experiences. He's inviting you to discover him for yourself. But nobody can take that step. Nobody can make that journey for you. And honestly, if we were just to be real, like we're often so busy kind of being the CEO of our own little universe, trying to run our kingdom, especially during the holidays, that we miss the one that it's really all about. So I have good news for you this morning. There is a God, there is a Messiah, and it ain't you and it ain't me. That's really good news. In fact, why don't you take a moment, tell the person next to you, just look at them and say, there's a God and it ain't you. Go ahead, tell them. Didn't that feel good? There's a lot of additional commentary. None of that was needed. See, I told you. See, every time we grasp for control, we miss out on the hope and the joy and the peace and the beauty that we're so desperately searching for and trying to hold on to and trying to grab a hold of. So Herod and his advisors and the religious leaders and all of Jerusalem, they were disturbed. But it was actually the exact opposite for the wise men. Check out what happened. So they leave in Matthew chapter 2, verse 9. After the interview, the wise men went their way. And the star that they'd seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem, and it went ahead of them, and it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. And they entered the house, and they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. Stinking Joseph gets no credit in this story. And they opened the treasure chest, and they gave him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. What a difference! That they were filled with joy. You have one group of people that they get the news and it's disturbing. And you have another group of people that they arrive at that place and they're overwhelmed with celebration and with joy. Have you ever noticed that different environments have different energies to them? I'm not trying to be weird, but you know what I mean. Like different places have different atmospheres. I mean, just think about it this way. Like if you go to a Steelheads game, there's a particular kind of atmosphere there. It's a lot of fun. You should go. Versus if you go to the local library. There's a completely different energy, completely different atmosphere. And if you bring those energies, you reverse them, they would be very different experiences, right? And every place has that about it. It has an energy, a vibe, an atmosphere. Which is maybe why some of us don't want to go certain places or stay with certain family members at the holidays anymore, because that home or that place or that experience, there's just something about it that I'll go there for the meal, but I don't want to stay there. And the truth is, it's possible for us to actually do Christmas in a way that destroys the power and the beauty of Christmas in our life. I mean, we talk about hope and we talk about joy and we talk about peace, but most of the time during this time of year, we're filled with stress and despair and tension and dread and anxiety and fear. We want to slow down and breathe and rest, but we're more frantic and frazzled than ever most of the time. And so you have these guys traveling from one place to another, and they leave the capital city. They leave this breathtaking palace. They leave the lap of luxury, and they end up in a cow town in the middle of nowhere with a poor family that's living or staying in a tiny hut or a cave or a stable or something like that. And on the outside, the contrast seems like it should be the other way around, right? You'd think that the palace would be the place of joy and celebration, and that the poor family in the cave would be kind of the depressing, hopeless scene or the experience. But here's what makes this story unlike any other story. When Jesus is at the center of something, it changes everything. When Jesus is at the center of something, you can feel it. It creates a certain atmosphere, not just when it's a label, not just when it's religious, not just when we're pretending, but the real Jesus experience, it's different. You can sense it. You can know it. It's life-changing. My favorite description, whether it's in Luke or Matthew, my favorite verses in all of the story of Christmas is found in Luke chapter 1, verses 78 and 79. And there are actually two lines that are taken out of the middle of a song by a guy named Zechariah, who was serving at the temple. In the middle of the song, he says this. He says, "Because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death. And he will guide our feet into the path of peace." See, that is God's intention. That's God's heart towards you. Tender mercy, shining his light, his love, his warmth into the dark and fearful and messed up places of life, of the world, of our hearts, of our families, of our experiences, bringing life to what's dead, guiding, not forcing, not manipulating, not commanding or demanding, but guiding your feet onto the path of peace. Man, does our world need the path of peace? Man, do I need the path of peace in my life? In Matthew's story, verse 12, he says, "When it was time to leave, the wise men returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod." How tragic to be somebody that God warns other people about. I never want to be the person that God whispers to others and goes, "Don't go back to him because he's not really searching for me." I want to be like the wise men. I want to be on a quest for God and bring others along in that journey. I want to be pursuing and open to and experiencing wherever God may lead. Who are the people that God has placed in your path to help you discover God's heart and God's love for you? Maybe more appropriately for you, who has God placed in your path so that you can help them discover his heart and his love for them? Because the signs are all around us, and they're never more obvious than at Christmas. In fact, when the angels announced to the shepherds in Luke 2, they said, "This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." That is the message of Christmas, that heaven has come crashing into earth. That's the good news of great joy for all people, that the divine has taken on flesh and blood to bring us hope and joy and peace and life. You might think you were born in the wrong place. You might have grown up believing different things, or you might have been hurt by Christianity or a church or somebody that stood in the place and spoke for or represented God. You might think that the distance between you and God is too great because of all of that. But the only distance that matters this morning is actually the distance between your heart and his. Because there is no distance between you and God that Jesus hasn't already traveled to get to you. See, ultimately, Christmas is the story. It's the tale of two kings, where you had Herod, who was desperate for control and selfish, ruled by fear. And you had Jesus, representing divine possibility, that God has brought the dead things back to life. And Jesus, who sacrifices himself for us. Jesus, who steps into human history and brings love and grace and truth. See, the beautiful truth this morning is that all of the Herods of the world, they don't get the last word. Hope does. Joy does. Love does. Faith does. Jesus gets the last word. And so here's my question for you. Who are you? Where are you in that story? Or maybe a better way to ask it is, what will be the story of your Christmas this year? When all the traditions and the parties are done, when all the family has come and gone, when all the presents have been bought, wrapped, given, unwrapped, put away, forgotten, thrown away, when Christmas is just a memory and a story and you're into the new year and you're on to the next thing, who will you have been in the story? Well, you've been Herod. Obviously, you're not a murderous maniac. You may have thought about offing one of your in-laws before, but it's probably not likely to happen this time around. But it's not unlike us to be crazy control freaks, so obsessed with things going exactly the way we want them that we steamroll people and manipulate people to get what we want. Or maybe you're just the person that's looking in all the wrong places, missing God in the process. You know all the stuff, you know all the stories, you're surrounded by people who are filled with joy, but you just can't seem to find yours. Or will you be like the wise men, open, searching, watching, waiting, allowing God to guide your feet to the path of peace? What's the atmosphere going to be in your home? Going to be like in your home this Christmas? What's the atmosphere? What's the energy? What's to use more of a churchy word, what's the spirit you're going to carry with you when you go to your work, when you go to those gatherings? God is for you. The signs are all around. Because of the tender mercy of God, the rising sun has come to us, lighting up the darkness. What a tragedy to go through Christmas and miss it all. Let's pray together. God, for a lot of us, where we know these stories, we know these verses, some of the folks sitting in these chairs know these stories better than I do. We've heard them, we've told them, we've shared them. And God, I love this time of year. I'm still so captivated by how unlikely, by how remarkable, how unbelievable the Jesus story is. That you would step out of heaven, you would come to earth, you would lay aside the expression of being God, and you would take on time and space, flesh and bone, and you would be one of us. Lord, my heart for us as a church this year, for my family, for my own life, is, God, that we would be open to where you want to lead us, that we'd be mindful to the people that you've placed in our path. God, that in the midst of all that there is to do and the things that we want to experience, and God, that it's not the next pleasure that's going to fulfill us. It's stopping, pausing, resting at a manger, celebrating that love has come for us. That's when our lives will be filled with joy. It's not the palaces, it's not the money, it's not the gifts. It's your love for us. Lord, would you help us? A lot of us have challenging family circumstances or extended family that those relationships are strained, or God, we're dealing with just the pain of somebody we love that's no longer here. And while the world is seemingly celebrating, it feels like we're the ones that are missing it all, nursing a broken heart. God, thank you for meeting us in dark places and bringing your love. That the sun has risen on us, and that you will guide our feet into the path of peace. Help us to follow you so that we can see and experience all that you have for us this year. We love you. Amen. And
South
amen.
Hills Church, I just want to take a moment and say thank you for watching our service online. Whether you're watching it for the first time or you're watching it again because you enjoyed the service so much from the weekend, I'd like to take a moment and dive into our giving. Every week we give people the opportunity to give back and give to the local church so that God can continue to bless your lives and bless your finances. Here at South Hills, we believe that everything comes from God. We believe that He's the one that chose us and brought us into this world, gave us our gifts and talents and abilities. And I just want you to know that when we give, we are giving back what God has already given to us. If you've ever seen any of our envelopes at a South Hills campus, you'll see on there that it says, every week at South Hills, your generosity is giving people the opportunity to live a better story. And there's a scripture on there in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21 that says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I want to encourage you today to click down below and set up your giving, whether it's for the first time or whether you're doing reoccurring giving. We have 4 ways to give here at South Hills. 1, you can do it in person at any of our campuses through an envelope. Or 2, you can actually text any amount that you would like to 84321. And the third way is to download our Church Center app. I encourage you to do this one because the Church Center app gives you opportunity to stay connected with our church and your campuses. It's a great tool and resource for you to know what's going on. And the fourth way to give is to give online. You can go to southhills.org/give and you can set up your giving there. Whether you're a guest of our church or whether you are a member of our church, whether you simply just like to watch our services, I encourage you to trust God with your finances so that He can bless and anoint your finances, and you can be trusting God in this journey of living life to the fullest. I love you, and thank you for watching our online service today.